welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and today's guest writes some really twisty books, and her latest book is absolutely not an exception to that. So please tell the audience who you are and about your latest book.
Absolutely. So my name is Andrea Bartz. I am a thriller author. My books that are already out are The Lost Night and The Herd. And my book that just came out in August 2021 is called We Were Never Here. It is a Reese's Book Club pick and a Book of the Month option, and just became a New York Times bestseller, which is very exciting. But to tell you a little bit about the actual book itself, it is about two globetrotting best friends who, during a dream vacation through Chile, kill a backpacker in self-defense and decide to ditch the body and get out of there, get home. And even more chillingly, this is not the first time that one of their reunion trips has ended in bloodshed. So it's sort of about how their friendship is stretched to the limits, and as they feel the walls kind of closing in on their cover-ups, and it's twisty and it's fast-paced, and it's hopefully a lot of fun for readers.
Yeah, it really was. I think there was so much going on in this book, and you were never really sure who, if anybody, was actually an unreliable narrator. And that was some of the fun of it. The fact that the two young women were these, one of them came from more money, so she was able to really live the globe-trotting life. And the other one, not so much, but was, very much enamored with the idea of this. But just the fact that they would go on another trip after you find out that something went awry last time just blew my mind. So where did this whole story come from?
Yeah, so I have the idea for this book while I was on vacation myself. I have a good friend whom I know from here in New York, but now she lives and works in Australia, much like one of the characters, although that's all they have in common. And she and I both love travel and have met up at some various remote corners of the world to travel together. And in April 2019, she and I were in Chile together, and we traveled to Chile's Elqui Valley, which is this sort of stargazing farming region, very beautiful, kind of remote in the Andes Mountains. And it was shoulder season, so it was totally dead. The town that we stayed in was just totally dead. And so we quickly befriended the one and only other equally unsuspecting tourist there, who's this really awesome guy named Steven. He was Australian. He was living in France. He was on this huge backpacking trip. And we just immediately were like old friends. The three of us were inseparable while we were all in town. And he was actually so cool and not creepy and respectful and kind that we immediately had a running gag about how he was like a psycho who was just biding his time until he could kill us and steal our wallets and run. And so we just kept making jokes about this. And on the last night, we were all sitting around in the hotel suite that my friend and I had gotten, drinking wine. And someone made another joke about how Steven was just, running out of time if he was going to kill us and take our money. And I just kind of tilted my head and out of nowhere said, Steven, you've known us exactly as long as we've known you. And you didn't even see me pour this glass of wine you're drinking. So what makes you so sure that you don't need to be afraid of us? And, everyone kind of froze up, and he was kind of like, I guess I don't. And then someone said, that sounds like a thriller. And, by the end of the night, we'd sort of jokingly come up with this idea. But I was really struck by this idea that even I, someone who's always thinking about gender dynamics within violence and safety and fear, even I had just sort of fallen into this default assumption that if anyone was going to be afraid of anyone, then we women should be afraid of this one man. Like, that's just the way that the arrow of, violence goes. And, more, that's sort of the micro story, but in a more macro way, I also worked as a travel writer. Obviously COVID brought that to a halt, but I've been to many countries by myself. And so I'm constantly having people say to me, like, wow, you're so brave, or I wouldn't want to go there on my own, or I wouldn't let my daughter go there on her own, or just sort of this idea that, like, wow, if you're a woman traveling alone, like, you are just asking to be, killed or assaulted or robbed or worse, right? And there's just always this assumption that, you're almost bringing it on yourself. The arrow of violence is going to go from the man to the woman. So I just sort of thought, what would be a way I could turn that idea on its head in a thriller plot and have it so that the women were not the receptacles or the victims of violence for once, but the perpetrators of it. And so that's kind of how this idea of, killing a backpacker on vacation came about. And I really spun the whole book out of that hook.
Which is funny, but really not, because we're talking about murder. Because
Yeah.
now I'm thinking about this Netflix series that I recently saw about somebody who killed backpackers, but this was like in the 70s and 60s, called The Serpent. And I don't know if you saw that.
I haven't watched it yet. I've heard of it and heard I should.
But I suppose just the idea of people going off grid when they're backpacking doesn't sound like something that it's unheard of, but you would never imagine that it would be because you're crossing paths with, like young privileged white women.
Exactly.
or I mean, like you said, Kristen and Emily have their side of the story as well, and it doesn't really have a cut way that you can go depending on what you're reading. And that's what I really liked about the story itself, without giving too much away. You're watching everything through Emily's eyes, and you're listening to the story that Emily told, and it sounds very much like something that could happen. And, the fears of what could happen to you if you're a woman alone backpacking, or, even if, like, by accident, somebody happens to die and you're around in another country, what could happen? So there's a lot there. I think, like, you referenced the movie Broke Down Palace a lot, which I remember very much from.
So that's interesting. It really struck with you. The women only mention it once in dialogue.
I thought it was more than once, but right, maybe it was just in the back of my mind while I was reading it. But for listeners who are not familiar, that is a movie with, I think it was Claire Danes, and I forget who else, where they are in a foreign prison for a crime, and it's a little crazy. But I really did love this story. Another thing I loved about it was that it sort of fits within these true crime related stories like Saint X or Cartwheel, which kind of deal with either Natalie Holloway or Amanda Knox, but it's a different type of story by far. And it was just really well done. Where do you come up with all of your plot twists?
Oh, thank you. Well, as I said, I start writing with just that hook, that idea. And so I write without an outline. I'm not sure where the story is going to go. And as you said, I write in first person, so I know I'm in the mind of one character, and inevitably we're all unreliable narrators, right? We're all only seeing one slice of the truth. And, every person has had the experience of recounting a shared event with someone else who was there, and the other person goes, wait, no, that's not how it happened. And it's kind of a creepy thing, but we all have to sometimes come face to face with the fact that our memories and our experiences even are not sort of the Bible truth, the gospel truth. So, I started writing from her perspective. I knew about, these acts of violence and what they were going to do and try to escape. And I wasn't sure what would happen after that. And so for me, the plot twists and sort of the surprises and reveals occur to me as I'm writing them, as they end up on the page. And so they're often quite shocking to me as well, which is really fun. And sometimes I have to go back and seed them a little more, but it does make me laugh when a reader is like, I saw X coming from the first page. I'm like, I didn't. Like, how did you know before I did? But yeah, I knew I really wanted it to explore both kind of that macro issue of, women's safety and violence, but then also sort of the emotional violence within a friendship, within a very, very close, potentially codependent friendship. And I didn't want it to be cut and dried. I didn't want it to be like one person is clearly the bad one and one's the good one. I wanted them to both, have a lot of love and, sort of loyalty to each other, because I just thought to your point, if I was ever going to go on a trip again with someone after something horrible happened, like they would need to be someone I fully, wholly, truly loved and trusted. And, someone I really wanted to make amends with. And that's why I would say yes to another trip. And so that sort of plays out throughout where, I, as the writer, was sort of mapping both. I was only writing from one perspective, but I was thinking about both of the women's perspectives and how they're dealing with this trauma and how they're viewing the friendships at every point. And that was sort of informing every time that they come together, the conflict, the stakes, the dialogue, because they're both, dealing with this trauma and this horrible thing. And it's coming out within sort of the fireworks of their friendship together. So for me, it was just sort of watching that unfold and potentially self-destruct, with also sort of the walls closing in, that swiftly sinking elevator of this, mediocre cover up in another country. And there's going to be a cat and mouse of authorities being on their tail. And so with all those different sort of, rockets launched at Emily, our narrator, I was just following her along for the ride.
Yeah, you deal with the idea of toxicity within friendships in some of your other novels as well, which I really like. And I think one thing about this one that I loved was it was specifically two friends. Yeah. And there often is an interesting power dynamic with a duo like that. I mean, like, especially like the Herd, there were sisters, but then there were also friends specifically, but this was just like two friends literally against the world. Right. And one of them had a lot more than the other, and therefore kind of held a little bit more of a power over the other. And I think that was a really interesting thing to look at, because I think that's a very accurate thing that happens, or I should say that is a very real thing that happens within friendships. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a very common pairing with friendships and also with romantic relationships, that, one person is a little more, will take direction, a little more go with the flow, a little bit less of a strong personality, and the other person is a little more type A, more take charge, more sort of the decision maker. And that's often a really good pairing. I don't think that's inherently a problem, but it can be. And I think a lot of the book is Emily trying to figure out, like, this person, I know that this friend of mine, Kristen, loves me, cares for me, takes care of me. And so is it a truly supportive relationship, equal relationship, or is there, a power, a sort of, power differential that is playing out before our eyes? And that's a hard thing to see. It's a hard thing to know when you're in it. And I think most people have experienced sort of probably both sides of that. within friendships and romantic relationships. And you're absolutely right. Like, my earlier books are really about friend groups. The Lost Night is a kind of a murder mystery set in like the loft parties of Brooklyn circa 2009, and the hipsters on rooftops. And The Herd is set within a sort of a mystery whodunit set within an exclusive all-female co-working space in Manhattan. So kind of that, bougie, beautiful friend group of perfect seeming women. And this one specifically is just about two friends and like really the closeness of their friendship. But I think I really like exploring I like taking readers into sort of the closed door, close-knit world of friendships. And I think within the world of thrillers, there's so much domestic noir. There's so much that's focused on a primary romantic relationship, right? Domestic noir is all about like, they seem to have the perfect marriage, or the jealous ex, or the widow, or the widower, or there's some configuration of like a primary relationship. And, I myself was single much of my 20s and early 30s. And I just felt like I had plenty of juicy relationships to explore within my friendships. And so I think that's kind of a through line in my books, is these like really complex relationships between women.
I love it. And I love how you pointed out that a lot of these thrillers are romantic based. There's so much room for what you were just speaking about, because I think it's very common for especially young women who are single or, who are kind of dating, but maybe something hasn't stuck, and that's okay. But they do travel together or just, spend time doing whatever. And that, I think, is something that we haven't seen as much in thrillers. So I like the friendship thriller, I think is pretty great. You do a really good job of it. And I don't know why, but my mind went to a very funny place. I'm like, okay, so what's next? We have the romantic domestic thriller. We have the friendship thriller. Like, what about a thriller through the eyes of like the house cat or something? What's coming next?
I think you might have $1 million idea. You need to write that.
Oh my gosh, I'm terrible. But if you want to take it, you go ahead and just dedicate the book to me. Question, how has you mentioned you were a travel writer before this, and the pandemic has changed it. Did you write We Were Never Here during the pandemic?
So I actually finished a first draft of We Were Never Here in February 2020. I spent the month in Mexico by myself. Definitely one of those, I wouldn't want to do that trips, but I had a wonderful time. So I finished it right before the pandemic and had my own revisions to do. And so I remember the first draft was due to my editor April 30th, 2020. So I was in New York City. I was in my tiny studio apartment with my cat. And at sort of the worst time of, the worst chunk of that beginning of the pandemic, I was just home and working on my own revisions. And it was really nice actually to have something to focus on. And then I turned it in, and then I remember I was like, oh gosh, now what? Like, what do I do now that I can't travel? I don't have any other articles in the works as a freelancer, and this book is turned in. So yeah, I did the revisions for it over that summer, about a year ago. And so a lot of it was done, a lot of the work was completed during the pandemic, and I had no idea when I had begun to write it that, foreign travel would feel so foreign by the time the book actually came out. So I think it was nice for me to be able to escape into this book and to try to capture these different settings. We see the women in Cambodia, we see them in Chile, we see them in Wisconsin, For me, it was nice to sort of mentally have to travel in a period where we were all kind of trapped indoors. And certainly I thought by the time the book came out in August 2021, like the pandemic was going to be a distant, in the distant past. But here we are. It's my second pandemic book release because The Herd came out in late March 2020. Nothing else going on then. So I sort of know the drill, but this is my second pandemic and hopefully final pandemic launch for now.
Are you writing something at the moment, or did you find it hard to write during these crazy times?
Yeah, I am working on something new. I didn't start it until the beginning of this year. So, by the beginning of this year, I was sort of ready to have new work and to, pour creativity into something new. My next thriller, I can't say too much about it yet, but it still centers sort of complicated relationships and very, unlike We Were Never Here, which is sort of, sweeping and globetrotting. This one is very claustrophobic and set within one sort of stifling setting, and gets really into the intricacies of relationships, friendship, and romantic. And it should be coming out in 2023. So everyone should keep an eye out for that.
Very exciting. So before we sign off, question, do you have any favorite media, books or otherwise, that are sort of focused on the dynamics of friendship?
Always. So some books that really explore the dynamics of friendship and just, the relationships, complex relationships between women that I've loved include In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. That came out recently. So great. Lori Elizabeth Flynn's The Girls Are All So Nice Here. They're both sort of campus thrillers and whodunits and just so juicy and fantastic.
I've mentioned several times on this podcast that book destroyed me. Usually when I read a book, I'm like, I have my 5-minute break because I have to read a lot of books, and I like to read a lot of books, but for the podcast also, I read a lot of books. That book, I needed a while before I could pick up another book because it just broke me.
That is a really, a delicious and sort of rough one. Another one I really liked that I think came out in 2019 about a very sort of toxic female friendship was Everyone Knows How Much I Love You, but a very, very fun one, and sort of a thriller, but mostly just wicked, beautifully written. Another one I needed to recover from afterward. Wow. And it actually reminded me of a not new one, Claire Messud's The Woman Upstairs, about, a woman who sort of has this very intense friendship with a couple that from the first page, all falls apart. I just love sort of the rage within both of those books and how they sort of plumb the inherent horrors of womanhood and, the boxes that we put women in. And, they're so creepy and interesting. Some other ones that jumped to mind that I kind of learned about because they were compared to The Herd include Self-Care by Lee Stein and A Special Place for Women by Laura Hankin.
And the one you mentioned before is Kyle McCarthy.
McCarthy. And they're both kind of about girl boss, female empowerment culture, these sort of special microcosm societies for high achieving women, and they're both a lot of fun and very well written. So that's just a few that could get anyone started who loves the sort of complex female friendship genre. Oeuvre.
Have you read Necessary People by Anna?
Oh, that's another great one. Anna Petoniak, so good. Yes, that's another one that really informed We Were Never Here. Just the ultimate toxic friendship story. I loved it.
Well, thanks so much. I really hope. Well, first of all, you're in Brooklyn, you said. Are you still in New York?
I am still in New York. Yeah, I'm still in Brooklyn.
Maybe when things open up again, we could invite you to Syosset Library for an event.
Yes, I cannot wait to do things in person again. So let's definitely keep in touch.
All right. Well, this has been wonderful. I cannot wait to see what you have on the horizon. And, like I said, if you want to do a feline domestic thriller, just put my name in. Thank you. And we are square.
We are good to go. Yeah. Well, thank you for the free idea. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on and for your time and for everyone who jumped in and listened.
Yes. So your book is available at Syosset Library, libraries everywhere, bookstores everywhere, and should be read by everyone. This is Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Andrea Bartz, author of Who Would Ever Hear, The Herd, and The Lost Night.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.